This technique is called sumac. I'm going to start with my light green, and I am going to show you two different materials to do it with. We're going to use just this wool yarn, and then we're going to also use the roving. So I'm going to do about like 2 lengths, and then I'm going to double that because I'm going to come back again with that same stitch. The sumac stitch creates a braid, and there's 2 ways that you can make the braid look. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to stitch the end in to hide it away and tuck it up there. And when I'm doing sumac, it can vary how many strings you go over as you're doing it. For this thickness and the look that I want it to have, I'm going to go 1, 2, 3 strings over. And then I always want to make sure that when I come back up and around, so I'm going to go over those and I'm going to wrap around that warp string and pull through. I'm making sure that I'm always doing the same thing. So right now I'm coming below where my loop is. So as I go through this to make the stitch create that braid, I want to make sure that I'm always doing the same thing that I started doing. So I'm going to go over 3, so including the one I wrapped around. So 1, 2, 3. I'm going to loop around that one and pull through and see how the loop will go. It'll start low and go high or above. So I'll loop around 1, 2, 3, around this one, pull through, 1, 2, 3, loop around, 1, 2, 3, loop around, 1, 2, 3, loop around. And now when I've gotten to the end, because of the amount of warp strings I have, I only have 1 more warp string, so I'll only be able to go around 2. That's just fine. So I'm going to loop around that. I like to go around it twice, so I'll loop around that twice. And I'm going to change directions and come back. Now this time, I have to make kind of a choice. Do I want it to match up on the same warp string as this braid, or do I want it to nestle in between? On this one, I'm going to show you where it matches up on that warp string. So I'm going to loop around, and then I'm making sure that I'm coming underneath just like I did before. And then I'm always going to do it on the same warp string that it was. So it'll be 1, 2, 3, and around that one. We just had to change up our pattern for that first one because of the difference in the warp strings. 1, 2, 3, wrap around and come out underneath the loop. 1, 2, 3, around and underneath. 1, 2, 3, around and underneath. And I keep going all the way until the end. So you'll notice with this braid that the ends meet together, kind of like a fishtail braid almost. And it's kind of similar to, it looks similar to the twining stitch, but it's not quite as secure as that one just because it doesn't wrap around every warp string. With this tail, whenever I can, I like to tuck them in as I'm going, and I can easily hide this one. So I'm just going to do over under, especially when there's like this little gap, because it can easily tuck up in there. So I'll hide that away, and that can just sneak behind, and I don't have to worry as much about that later. All right, now I'm going to use some roving. What's nice about sumac is you can kind of change up how many warp strings you use depending on how thick your yarn is. But the more warp strings you skip, the more you need to make sure that you're locking it in place later on. So I'm going to use probably this thickness. You can always rip it in half or double it if you wanted a different thickness. But I'm going to start with this, but I think mine's probably a little too long. So I'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'll pull it apart. And I'm just going to take that tail like I did before, and I'm going to stitch it in there, over, under, just to secure it. And then I'm going to do the same thing. This is thicker, so I think with this one, I'm probably going to do 5 warp strings. Let's try it out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'll go over those and come back. So I'm looping around and coming back. And then I'll count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'll loop around and come back. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Loop around And you can see how much thicker that is than this one. It's even kind of covering that one up a bit. Pull that through, and then I just have one more warp string on the end, so I want to make sure that I pick that up. So I'll just loop around that one, and like I did before, I'm going to loop around it twice just to help secure that. And then I'm going to come back. This time, instead of matching up like I did with this, I'm going to have it nestle in between. So I'm going to have it end early. So this time I'm going to just do 4, so it ends early. And see how it kind of pushes up into there. So this will change my braid. Now I can go back to my 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that will still nestle up into that one. So it just creates a little bit of a different, like more of a braid than a fishtail braid design to it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Push that up in, and then same with this. I'm going to loop around, and then I'm going to stitch back to kind of lock it in place. There we go. So that's making this big fluffy braid, and it's a little bit different than this fishtail where they meet up. Now, because this is, you can kind of notice my strings, my warp strings are sticking out a bit because this is such a thick fiber. What I'm going to do is I'm going to lock it in place with a bit more of my regular yarn. So I can either do a twining stitch, or I can do a tabby plain weave to lock it in place, but I need to do something that's going to help this be secure. Especially when we look at the back of it, we'll notice that a lot of warp strings have been missed. I'm just going to tuck this in. So I am going to pull that a little bit tighter than I normally would, just to get it back to being kind of even with these sides. And that's what's nice about the plain weave and the twining stitch. They help to straighten out those warp strings, give it some structure to make sure that when we take it off, there's not, it's kind of even on the sides. Sometimes when you're doing like the bigger stitches, it will get off. It will be a little uneven on the sides, and I think that's part of the imperfection of the medium of weaving. I think that's kind of beautiful in itself. So try not to get too bent out of shape on it being out of shape a little bit, but we can do things like use these stitches to help bring it back to being a little more even with that above spot. Okay, so I'm going to do one more just to kind of lock it in place, and you can see that now my strings are a little bit more even, and they're about the same as up top. Okay, so that was 2 ways to do your sumac stitch.